Welcome to this third session in the study of the book of Revelation, historically significant with great significance for today. In the first session, we pondered the fact that a person named John wrote this book for a group of 7 congregations located up and down the coast of what they called Asia Minor, that today we would call Turkey. The best reconstruction of their situation is that they were tempted to compromise their Christian faith, their allegiance to Lord Jesus, by becoming too complicit, too accommodating with the Roman Empire and its ruler, Lord Caesar. So John writes this book to assure them that God is moving inexorably toward ending this present age and unfolding a new heaven and a new earth. And John writes passionately because John wants them to be a part of this age. The second session focused on the throne room of heaven and on the sovereignty of God and on the reliability of God's promises and on the unrelenting nature of God's purposes. A part of the big change from the old to the new, from the Empire of Rome to the realm of God, is a moment of transformation, which includes something about which many modern people are uncomfortable, and that is judgment, condemnation. And that gets us to the vision which is at the center of our attention today, the opening of the seals, the first 4 seals at least, on the scroll that John describes in Revelation 6. This is a picture of the circumstances that call for judgment, and it implies coming condemnation and something about which we need to think more carefully. At the center of the vision is a scroll, and it is a sealed scroll. So I would represent it as something like this. In the ancient world, a scroll was often a symbol for interpretation or understanding. Side note, very few people in the ancient world could read and write. Literacy rate may have been as low as 2 or 3%, probably not as high as 10%. But the fact of the scroll indicates that someone wants to preserve a particular interpretation for a very long time. This scroll is an interpretation of history which the writer regards as authoritative because it comes from God and it has been sealed with 7 seals. The typical scroll in antiquity would have been rolled up, 1 dot of wax would be placed on it, and someone with a signet ring or some other means of establishing a seal would plunge into the hot wax to demonstrate that the contents were under the control of the one who sent the document. When the document is opened, then people can understand the world from the standpoint articulated in the scroll. In John's case, it isn't that the scroll itself is completely unrolled at this point, but that the seals, one after another, open, and each seal reveals something. It reveals something that is both present, but whose consequences will be future. If I may put it this way, the scroll is a kind of guide to interpreting events that are taking place in John's world. So it has a very strong present dimension. At the same time, the consequences of these events will play out not only in the present, but in the future. And each of the elements in the first 4 seals reveals circumstances in the present that call forth judgment and that eventuate in condemnation. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seals. When the first seal opens, it reveals a rider on a white horse. The rider is described as having a bow, and a crown was given, and the rider came conquering and to conquer. Because the rider is on a white horse, some interpreters have assumed that it was a reference to Christ. But a better line of interpretation, now much more widely accepted, is that the rider is on the white horse in order to imitate the whiteness that is associated with the Ancient of Days and the heavenly world. Most scholars today think that the rider is Caesar masquerading as divine, and that the first seal displays, unmasks, reveals that Caesar is an idol, and in the Jewish tradition, idolatry is one of the fundamental sins that often leads to condemnation and destruction. So this first seal, depicting the rider holding a bow, an instrument of war, and wearing a crown, is a way of alerting listeners to the dangers of idol worship associated with the cult of the emperor that we described in an earlier session. That is, people would go to a shrine where there was a representation of Caesar and make an offering and make a confession of faith. And John, by placing Caesar in the scroll that points toward judgment, is saying so clearly to people who follow in Caesar's way that you will share Caesar's fate. The second seal opens, and it reveals a red horse. A red horse, and its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another with, and it was given a great sword. Interpreters, I need to get a sword in here. Interpreters are of the mind today that this horse represents the violence that was characteristic of the Roman Empire, and especially the fact that the Roman government kept the peace of Rome, kept a lid on social movements by means of the Roman army, which was dispersed throughout the Mediterranean basin. This is also a way of saying that when you are witnessing a culture in which violence is part and parcel of the everyday life, you are witnessing a culture that is straying terribly from the purposes of God, and not so clear here, but certainly implied, that a culture of violence will bring about its own judgment. I'll come back to this at the end of our session, but there is a principle here that is so easy to see in connection with this seal. That principle is articulated, implied in the first 39 books of the Bible, articulated especially in the Wisdom of Solomon, articulated later and always assumed by the book of Revelation, and that is that the means of judgment is the means of sin. That is, the way whereby a community sins, in this case, by relying upon violence, becomes the means whereby God punishes sin. That is, a community that relies upon violence will be judged, condemned, and punished by violence. It will receive a violent end. And this proved to be prophetic on John's part. It took a long time. It took into the early 400s. But Rome collapsed under the very kind of violence by which it ruled. The third seal, I'll make it, give it a little more room here. The third seal reveals a horse that is black. We often think of a black horse, we often associate the color black with the color of death. In this particular instance, the color of black is not associated directly with death, but on it sits a figure holding a scale. I'm going to make a scale like this. Holding a scale, and there is a voice that says, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine." These prices are incredible. They point to a shortage of food on the part of wheat and barley for the masses. And they point to the wealthy having unlimited resources for oil and wine. This seal is a way of calling attention to the profound disparity present in the Roman social pyramid, and it passes a word of judgment over the fact that those who are in the bottom 97% of the pyramid are placed in such extreme economic circumstances that a whole day's wage would be given over to a little lump of wheat. There is about this a fundamental injustice, especially as those in the very top of the pyramid have unlimited access to oil and wine. In the social pyramid of antiquity, 1.5% of the population controlled 40% of the material resources. In today's world, 1% of the population controls 40% of the material resources. Really, how far have we come? And the fourth seal depicts a pale green horse. On which there is a rider named Death, followed closely by Hades, and they were given authority to kill with sword, famine, pestilence, and by wild animals. This is a way of saying that the living conditions under which so many people in antiquity lived were the result of an inequity in the way in which resources were distributed and would contribute to the final destruction of the empire. Now there is a fifth seal and a sixth seal. The fifth seal raises a significant theological problem as it depicts an altar and a group of souls or people under the altar. And they cry out. They cry out, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" They're given a white robe and told to rest a little while until the great transformation should take place. I have to say, this part of the book troubles me theologically. These under the altar are people who have maintained faithfulness in the face of the Roman threat, and for one reason or another, they have lost their lives because of it. Tragic. Exposes the empire for what it is. And yet I am troubled by their cry, which is a cry for vengeance. "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood?" No matter how unjust the act, no matter how savage the violence, calling for violence in return seems to me only to intensify what we sometimes call the spiral of violence. But there is about this aspect of the vision, this redeeming quality, it calls attention to the fact that God pays attention to the way in which we treat one another, and God does not forget acts of violence. I think for myself, I just have to say, I wish they had said something else, something more reconciling. And so I place myself in some tension with the words of the saints under the altar, even while recognizing that their cry against violence is a part of the movement toward which the Roman Empire collapses under the weight of its own violence. The sixth seal moves now from the social arena to the cosmic, and it is epic in its description. There is a great earthquake, the sun becomes black, the full moon like blood, the stars of the sky fall to earth, the sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up. Then the kings of the earth, the magnates, the generals, the rich and the powerful, and every one, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us. Hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come." Judgment comes not only on social, but also on the cosmic structures that have supported the life of the old age. The first part of this vision, the collapse of the sun, the moon, the heaven, indicates that an anti-creation is taking place. God put these elements in the dome in order to help hold it up at creation. They are a part of the structures of the old world. And there is a little political cartoon at work here in that the Romans worshipped these elements, which from John's point of view are not gods and goddesses at all. They are elements of creation under the authority of God, and having not fulfilled their purpose in creating a world of blessing, fall under judgment. And how pathetic a picture it is that those who are so powerful in this world become so fearful when the structures that support their power are threatened, and they seek to hide themselves from the wrath that is to come, but from which there is no hiding. So on the one hand, I would say this judgment, this vision, is a clue with respect to how to read the news. Wherever we see idolatry, self-centeredness, self-preoccupation, self-importance, wherever we see violence, wherever we see social inequity, especially reinforced by the structures of society, wherever we see people abusing their power, self-serving rather than serving others, we see violations of God's purposes, and we see circumstances that contribute to judgment and finally condemnation and destruction. Now, many Christians, and I am among them, do not believe that a God of love would actively seek such circumstances upon others. But we do not have to believe that God brings about destruction as a result of divine initiative. I believe that violations of God's purposes create the conditions in community that invite destruction upon ourselves. In this respect, the message of the book of Revelation is so similar today to the way in which it was articulated in antiquity. We have the opportunity, we are invited, we are urged to turn away from those things represented by these seals and to turn toward the ways of God, the ways of love, mutual support, peace, justice, abundance, dignity, and freedom.